What is going on, Neon Nation, and welcome back to the Neon Arcade for some more Cyberpunk 2077 news. Yesterday, the Cyberpunk 2077 community podcast sat down with lead quest designer of Cyberpunk 2077, Paweł Sasko, for around 2.5 hours to talk about 2077, its development, and details about the upcoming RPG. I suggest you guys check out the full podcast, and I will link it in the description, but I wanted to make a brief synopsis video on some of the more standout points made throughout the podcast. It was really informative, and towards the end we got a brief philosophy and mantra of CD PROJEKT RED when it comes to creating their games, so again it's worth the full watch. Getting right into the first question, we asked if Paweł had a quest in the game that was on par with some of his previous works in quests like the Bloody Baron, the Spoon Collector, and Wedding Quest in Hearts of Stone from The Witcher. Paweł mentions that one of the designers on his team is working on something that is standout for him, but he doesn't necessarily want to spoil it. He does go on to mention though that emotional connectivity makes the best quests, and that quests will try to pull you into a wide variety of emotional states. When it comes to the feeling of paranoia in the world, Sasko mentions that this is a big element that ties into the noir characteristics of Cyberpunk. He mentions that in this sense, The Witcher was a bit more of a cheerful environment, and that Cyberpunk aims to keep the player paranoid in their decision making by deceit being a big element of 2077. We can also finish quests in non-traditional and ridiculous ways, and it won't always call for violence to occur. Paweł Sasko mentions that The Witcher had obvious, not so obvious, and super hidden ways to complete quests, and that Cyberpunk 2077 will largely follow the same mentality in their quest design. They create the narrative with a strong main story and branching secondary quests, and when it comes to relationships, they will emulate real life, and your choices in this department will blend from the main story into secondary quests and vice versa. Relationships are going to be useful in some surprising ways that Sasko doesn't want to mention. Unkillable NPCs are addressed through strong story context and tying these main NPCs to the plotline. If it's declared within the story that an NPC is pivotal to you, they will become immune to being killed, however there may be strong story moments where they are killable. Moving on, techies will utilize the spider bot, and you can command it to perform certain actions like takedowns, hacking devices, and dismantling objects to be used for crafting. You won't necessarily need to specialize in the techie tree to use this, as there is a fluid class system, and collecting parts will be done in different ways if you don't utilize the bot. Techies can also upgrade weapons, gear, and most pieces of equipment with the scrap that the flathead spiderbot collects. The spiderbot is used by issuing it commands, but your human companions will do their own thing and will have their own archetypes when approaching the battle. When asked if there were slower paced, more detective work styled quests, as opposed to more combat heavy missions, Sasko mentions that they learned a lot from the detective missions from The Witcher, and that the Kuroshi optics will largely be used in these. A core element to these quests is uncovering things not apparent to the naked eye. You will be able to do additional detective work during quests for different results in them, or you can take the path of least resistance in solving these. When it comes to loot, Paweł mentions that it's connected to the story and will be tied to what the player is experiencing at that time. He mentions the example from the 48-minute demo where the Maelstrom was holed up in the All Foods plant with equipment they've stolen from Militech. In this segment of the game, the loot within this area is tied to Militech, the Maelstrom, and the All Foods plant. There are segments with special loot, and the flathead is a kind of special item, but there are more special loot moments in the game. When it comes to balancing the quests with the entirety of the fluid class system, Paweł mentions that this is incredibly hard. They want to have a certain degree of freedom and make each class feel meaningful, but they don't want to kill it with over-complexity. CDPR wants people to be able to create their fantasy character, and their iterations of each of the subclasses of the fluid class system has taught them a lot about making impactful gameplay. Answering a question about if weather and time affects quests, Paweł mentions that the day and night cycle will lead to different encounters in the world. There may be times where you're supposed to complete certain tasks, but companions may also offer you additional ways to complete them. Weather appears on the full spectrum, and they mainly use weather systems as a narrative storytelling element in much the same way they use music and the time of the day. Weather is more of a challenge than it first appears, as things like metal, skin, and fabric all have to look equally good when, for example, it rains and makes everything slick and wet. The Badlands have a more dialed in weather system, and there's an element of it Sasko doesn't want to spoil. In regards to if we can climb the social and economic ladder, Paweł suggests that this is connected to your choices and that climbing the ladder will be visible to some degree, but at the end of the day you're still a cyberpunk. There are ways to play the game to become wealthy, and the more connections you make, the more you're at the whim of positive and negative repercussions of these relations. The verticality of the map will play into some quests, and we can use mantis blades to hook onto walls, but we will not be able to scale buildings. Enemies will be using unique abilities based on their personal cyberware, and Sasko mentions that there are many archetypes of enemies. Enemies can do the same things V can do, but usually they're more specialized. Sasko mentions enemies with mantis blades and those who prefer close combat, enemies that are hacking based, and enemies that use combat stims like Kerenzikov and Sandvistan boosters. Moving on, different cars and bikes will have different stats, such as speed, handling, and the type of tires. Each car will feel different, and as you progress through the game, you will get vehicles with better stats, such as increased handling and speed. Customization of vehicles is a maybe, but it's not super high on the priority list. Braindance is pivotal to the main storyline and quests, but Paweł doesn't want to spoil anything in regards to this. When it comes to music, he mentions that they use music as a way to draw a picture in the player's imagination and help them understand the nature of the quest. They have special pieces of music for more important quests in the game that won't be repeated. He also mentions that they have an insane amount of hours of music for the game. There are underground areas of the map, although it's not overly extensive and is largely tied to missions and quests. Cyberpunk 2077 is heavily influenced by cyberpunk greats like Ghost in the Shell, both Blade Runners, and Akira, especially when it comes to visuals. When it comes to map size, Sasko mentions that he really doesn't have a concrete number, but that it does feel massive. Mega buildings, the Badlands, and underground areas make it feel dense but also large. Sasko also has a message for the community that the whole team at CDPR are insanely thankful for the attention Cyberpunk 2077 is getting, and that they're overwhelmed with how much interest 2077 got at Gamescom. He mentions that he doesn't care how much the game sells, but instead he wants to make a game that gets people invested in it, talking about it, and that they want to treat the community well. CDPR tries to stay honest and tell their fans what is and what's not in the game, and Paweł believes that you can make money making great games instead of making mediocre games laden with microtransactions. Thanks for watching guys, and for more Cyberpunk 2077 join Neon Nation by subscribing to the Neon Arcade.